March of the Machine is here, and with it the fall of the Phyrexian invasion, but not without claiming casualties first. One of our precons this set, Growing Threat, is a black and white list focused on the Phyrexians and a few familiar names that have succumbed to completion. What's this list all about, and how can we give it a tune-up to something really dangerous? Let's look at our box legend first. It's Brimaz, Blight of Oreskos. If that name sounds familiar, cast your mind back to Brimaz, King of Oreskos from the original Theros. Yes, it seems this Leonin hero has fallen to the dark side. He's now a 4-mana 3/4 Phyrexian cat with the following 2 abilities. Whenever you cast a Phyrexian creature spell or artifact creature spell, incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. At the beginning of each end step, if a Phyrexian died under your control this turn, proliferate. Let's take a second to look at Incubate, one of March of the Machine's unique mechanics. To incubate, you create an Incubator artifact token with X +1/+1 counters on it. You can then pay 2 generic mana to flip the Incubator into a 0/0 artifact creature token with those +1/+1 counters on it. Right away, Brimaz here does a few different things. He wants you to be casting Phyrexian creature spells, he wants you to be casting artifact creature spells, and he wants you to be proliferating. That's a lot of utility on a single body. It's also the first time Phyrexian creature type matters on a legend, which is very interesting. There was a massive creature type overhaul that made some of your favorite creatures in the format Phyrexians. Did you know that Massacre Worm is a Phyrexian now? Did you know that Wormcoil Engine is a Phyrexian now? And did you know that all of the Splicers are Phyrexian now? If you didn't, here's your cue to dust them off, because they're right at home under Brimaz. But the former King of Oreskos isn't the only new legend in Growing Threat. We also have the Phyrexianized duo of Moira and Teshar. Individually, these two were interesting, but together, they're deadly. Now fighting for the Phyrexians, this 5-mana 4/5 Phyrexian Spirit Bird has flying. Additionally, whenever you cast an historic spell, be it an artifact or legendary spell, you can return target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step, or if it would leave the battlefield. This duo is much more straightforward. They're a Reanimator commander. Casting historic spells and reanimating nasty threats from the bin is always an excellent archetype. But the fact that you can't reuse reanimated targets and you don't get dies triggers from these permanents, that takes a bit of the potential sting out of using them as a commander. Between these two, we get some new things, and we get a bit of a retread on some old themes. Before we check out the upgrade, make sure to hit all those good buttons. Like, subscribe, comment, and if you're planning on picking up this or any other precon, hit that bell to make sure you don't miss my other precon upgrade guides. Of these two, I'd really like to focus on Brimaz. He's got a lot of utility and opens up an archetype we've never seen before, Phyrexian Tribal. It gives us an excuse to play with some new toys from the latest sets, and revisit some old friends that have had their creature types updated. New in this precon are a few notable Phyrexians like Filigree Vector. This 4-mana 1/1 doesn't seem like anything to write home about, but as a Phyrexian construct it triggers Brimaz, and when it enters the battlefield we can put a +1/+1 counter on any number of target creatures, and a charge counter on any number of target artifacts. Additionally, we can pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice another artifact to proliferate. This does basically exactly what we want it to be doing in a deck led by Brimaz. In fact, it does exactly what we want to be doing in so many white decks that feature counters. Note that we don't have to sacrifice a non-token artifact for that proliferate ability, so losing clues, food, treasures, or even incubator tokens allows us to proliferate. This is a solid card for sure. And if we're leaning into Phyrexians as a creature type, the new Vulpine Harvester is excellent. A 4-mana 3/3 Phyrexian Fox. It says, whenever one or more Phyrexians you control attack, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield if its mana value is less than or equal to their total power. An amazing role player in either archetype in this deck. We can be sacrificing or milling artifacts, getting them back on attack with this little friend. Remember what I said about Wormcoil Engine being a Phyrexian? Well, the tokens it makes are Phyrexians as well. What a great way to make enough power to return itself to the battlefield every turn. And in the deck we're building, this card is key. Let's also take a look at Blight Titan, a Phyrexianized Grave Titan. This 6-mana 6/6 Phyrexian giant has Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield or attack, we mill 2 cards, then incubate X, where X is the number of creature cards in our graveyard. Not quite as powerful as the original, but making a single big body every turn and continuing to fill our yard certainly helps. More so with the reanimation archetype, but it's still a big Phyrexian for Brimaz's triggered ability. And the last new card I think really works in the deck is Excise the Imperfect, a 3-mana instant to exile target permanent and have its controller incubate X, where X is the permanent's mana value. This one is interesting. I don't think it's as good as Generous Gift in a lot of circumstances unless you need to be exiling a permanent. The likelihood of the incubator being bigger than a 3/3 is much higher. And with 2 white pips, Excise is a little bit harder to splash in higher colored decks. Black and white have a lot of great removal as it is, so I don't know if this is going to make the cut if you're including a full upgrade, but it's certainly a role player in the out-of-the-box deck. Now, if we're upgrading this to be a real Phyrexian tribal deck, where should we begin? If I'm cutting and adding just 10 cards, where do I start? First and foremost, let's cut cards that aren't Phyrexians. They may be fine utility, but they aren't serving a purpose in a Brimaz-led deck. So out comes Noxious Gearhulk, Cataclysmic Gearhulk, and Duplicant. These 3 make a lot more sense in a Reanimator-themed deck, as none are Phyrexians and none deal with any kind of counters that we can proliferate. They're good, but they're curve toppers in a deck with a mana curve that's already factoring in 7+ mana creatures. Speaking of, Meteor Golem, Angel of the Ruins, and Ancient Stone Idol can all get cut too. We aren't going to be cheating these bad boys into play, and while they trigger Brimaz's ability, they just don't care about proliferating on their own. With those 6 cuts, we've brought the average curve of the deck down significantly, and freed up more space for a few things that matter. Each of these precons includes a couple of cards specifically for plane chase use, like Path of the Schemer, Fractured Power Stone, and Ichor Elixir. This round of precons is coming with plane chase cards, which is cool, but the number of plane chase games you'll actually be playing shouldn't really have an impact on your deck construction. These should get cut. The last card that we should consider cutting is Psychosis Crawler. This is, in fact, a Phyrexian now, thanks to the creature type pass, but it's really functioning best when we're drawing oodles of cards. While this deck does draw its fair share thanks to a few of our creatures like Phyrexian Rager and Phyrexian Gargantua drawing us cards on enters the battlefield, I don't think this one will be as scary as it can be in a draw-specific archetype-focused deck. With room made for 10 cards, what are we adding? Let's look at more Phyrexians first and foremost. What cards were added in the creature type overhaul that fit in the deck now? Firstly are the living weapon creatures. There are a few in the list already. Nettlecyst, Scytheclaw, and the new Bitterhorn. But note that the Germ tokens are now Phyrexian Germ tokens. They may not trigger Brimaz's first ability, but because they make a 0/0 Phyrexian Germ, all we need to do to trigger Brimaz's Proliferate ability is to move the equipment off of the Germ. Pretty easy. This is where I'd love to recommend Batterskull and Bone Horde, 2 living weapons that add to this theme and ensure that we have a board state that can survive after a board wipe. Thanks to incubators only being creatures if we flip them, we can hold back a few to flip after a board wipe, then suit them up with these equipment to be right back in the game. Next up, let's look at a few creatures that are newly Phyrexian. Starting with Carnifex Demon. Originally just a demon, this 6-mana 6/6 comes into play with 2 -1/-1 counters on it. We can then pay a black mana and remove a -1/-1 counter from him to put a -1/-1 counter on each other creature. With Brimaz's Proliferate trigger, we could be doing this all the time. Each time essentially putting 2 -1/-1 counters on each creature our opponents control. Because of the way -1/-1 counters interact with +1/+1 counters, negating each other, we can keep our creatures the same size by proliferating each turn. And by ensuring the Carnifex Demon has 2 -1/-1 counters on him at all times, it means we never run out of fuel to keep shrinking opponents' creatures either. Next up is a simple one, but let's include Fume Spitter. This 1/1 for 1 was previously only a horror, but is now a Phyrexian horror, which can sacrifice itself to put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. This ability can not only trigger Brimaz's ability on an opponent's turn, but gives us more juicy targets to proliferate with that same triggered effect. Along the same lines, we have Phyrexian Plague Lord. The original Rock of The Rock and His Millions archetype fame, this guy's creature type now suits his name in becoming a Phyrexian. And much like Fume Spitter, the big benefit here is that he can enable us to sacrifice a creature at instant speed for no mana to trigger Brimaz's Proliferate ability, while acting as spot removal to take out a damaged creature or a mana dork. Worst case scenario, he can sacrifice himself to give a creature -4/-4 and still trigger Brimaz's ability. Bonus! Next up, let's look at some actual printed Phyrexians that can fit in the list. Starting with what I feel is a potential finisher in the deck, Scheming Aspirant. This 2-mana 1/3 is a Phyrexian advisor that drains each opponent for 2 every time you proliferate. While Brimaz will be helping us proliferate every turn and draining opponents for 2, let's see if we can include some more cards with repeatable proliferate engines to really carry this off the rails and make the Aspirant an actual threat. Like with Norn's Choirmaster. This is a new addition from the All Will Be One Commander Precons, but is a great fit for this deck. At 5 mana, this 5/4 Phyrexian Angel with flying and first strike allows us to proliferate whenever a commander we control enters the battlefield or attacks. Not bad as another source of buffing our creatures and increasing -1/-1 counters on opponent's creatures every turn. And to give us more to proliferate, let's include Aaron Benalia's Ruin. A 3-mana 3/3 with Menace, we can pay a white and a black and tap him to sacrifice another creature, putting a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. This gives us more to proliferate while allowing us to trigger Brimaz on each turn too. Another great add. Let's round out our adds with a few more artifacts that can help us proliferate, like Contagion Clasp. On enters the battlefield, we get to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, and later, we can pay 4 mana to proliferate. It's simple, it's easy, and it gives us more fuel to proliferate and more ways to proliferate. I'm surprised it's not in the default list. Then there's Glistening Sphere, another new one from All Will Be One's Commander Precons. This 3-mana rock enters tapped and proliferates on enters the battlefield. It creates 1 mana of any color, and if we can get an opponent with 3 poison counters on them, it taps to create 3 mana of any one color. That is a powerful mana rock. And lastly, I recommend Throne of Geth, a 2-mana artifact that allows us to tap and sacrifice an artifact to proliferate. Seems straightforward, right? Especially when you consider the tokens incubating makes flip into Phyrexian artifact creatures. Sacrificing a converted incubator meets Brimaz's proliferate trigger of a Phyrexian dying and acts as fuel for the throne. That's potentially 2 proliferate triggers a turn. That's starting to make that Aspirant look like a win condition now, right? And as a last add, we need something in the deck that can give our opponents poison counters. It's a valid backup win con with how often we can be proliferating, but there's nothing in the core list that actually does it. So let's add in Infectious Inquiry. It's a simple draw spell, but it gives each opponent a poison counter, and if cast before our engines get humming, is a good way to make sure the later the game goes, the quicker our clock can be. But infect and poison counters are something that we can talk about in the upgrade. There's a lot we can add to the deck if we're going wild with it. We could easily remove Phyrexian Scriptures in favor of Anointed Procession if money isn't an object, but an Anointed Procession on its own is the cost of this entire deck, so buyer beware. It does work phenomenally well with incubating though, giving us 2 tokens with twice as many counters whenever we incubate. If we're going to be as proliferate heavy as it looks like we are, then let's go all the way and add in Cathar's Crusade and Felidar Retreat. These 2 are free ways to get counters on all of our creatures every turn, and can replace a few of the less stellar creatures in the deck like Darksteel Splicer or Blade Splicer. These 2 have their uses, but they just don't point in the right direction for the deck, where the volume of +1/+1 counters we could be distributing is useful just about always. And I mentioned Wormcoil Engine 2. It is now a Phyrexian, along with the worm tokens it makes. If I had an extra one laying around, I'd swap it in place of Soul of New Phyrexia for a little spice and a bit of a better threat. If we're looking at a secondary dimension for the deck of poison counters, we need to be exploring Infect and Toxic. More ways to add them into the mix means a quicker path to victory. Perfectly valid. Skrell's Hive is a great addition, giving us Phyrexian mites every turn at the cost of a single life. Just one of these getting through gives us something to keep proliferating, and being that they are Phyrexian, we can sacrifice them to trigger Brimaz's proliferate ability every turn. The land Mirex could be a straight swap for a basic land in the deck too, giving us something to do with extra mana and making another toxic Phyrexian mite, potentially deadly on an empty board. And lastly, I'd recommend White Sun's Twilight 2. This is a board wipe I'd put in over Phyrexian Rebirth as a way to gain some life and make some mites and wipe the board. It's really solid and can create some real blowout scenarios late game, leaving you with a board full of toxic creatures and your opponents with nothing. Let me know what you think of the Growing Threat Precon and these recommended upgrades for a cheap way to queue up a more straightforward focused deck. If you've liked this guide, you have to subscribe. And be sure to check out these other upgrade guides too. As always, folks, good luck and have fun.